Greetings, students of Historical Theology. This is Ryan Litton, the professor for the course, and as students of Historical Theology, particularly early in the course, you may be wondering, what is Historical Theology? And so that's what this video is going to set out to discuss, is what do we mean by that? And simply, what we mean when we say Historical Theology is the study of theology in a historical period. I know that often people are not fond of defining a term using the term itself, but I think in this instance it works. If we understand theology as not just theology as the study of God, but of the study of anything that pertains to God, and we have two senses of the word theology. We have theology proper, which would be the study of God himself. And then we have the broader concept, the discipline of theology, which encompasses more than just God. Eschatology, for instance, is the study of the last things. And that isn't specifically a study of God himself, but yet it still falls under that larger umbrella of theology, the larger idea of theology. And so historical theology is simply taking that larger umbrella and then trying to look at a specific period in time to see how did they understand those ideas. And so where a systematic theology course perhaps would say, let's look at the doctrine of soteriology or the concept of justification by faith or those sorts of ideas, historical theologians would then say, not just let's look at soteriology, but let's look at soteriology in the 5th century. Or let's look at soteriology in the Reformation as Luther is splitting from the Catholic Church based on, sola fide and sola scriptura and, all the solas and all that stuff. And so historical theology is taking those concepts, which you were probably aware of from your theology courses, and then trying to figure out how did those concepts work out in particular historical periods. And generally this is done chronologically. We would begin with the patristic era, well, specifically the apostolic era, but apostolic era is basically the New Testament. And so we would start with that, move to the patristics. The patristics would take up, the first 600 or so years of the church. Then we move to the medieval period. Medieval period is going to be anything between the patristic period and the Reformation. And so the medieval period is going to bridge the gap between the earliest church and what we have with Luther, Calvin, Zwingli, those guys. And so then we would look at the Reformation period, which would then cover anything from around 1500 up until the modern period, which is usually going to be around 1700, 1800. Usually Enlightenment is kind of, the gatekeeper, so to speak, for that. And then the modern period, depending on who you talk to, is either going to last until now, or it's going to last until maybe the 19th or 20th century with the advent of postmodernism. And so we're going to look at those eras and see how do we trace theological ideas through those eras. How do we get from Irenaeus in the 2nd century battling the Gnostics in the south of France? How do we get from that to the emerging church and people like Rob Bell and that sort of thing over here in the 21st century? So how do we make that journey? That's the discipline of historical theology, just trying to figure out how do these ideas develop. And you want to do this when you're studying particular theological ideas. For instance, if you want to understand the Trinity more accurately, you probably want to look at how the church has handled Trinitarian theology, particularly in the Trinitarian controversy in the patristic era. And so you're going to want to look at people like Tertullian, who is the first person to use the word Trinity, although he didn't actually use the word Trinity in English, obviously. He used Trinitas, which is a Latin term, which is where we get the word Trinity. And so we get that from Tertullian. And so we get a lot of Trinitarian and Christological ideas from him. Then, moving forward a few hundred years, we get more Trinitarian ideas from people like Augustine, from the Cappadocian Fathers, and throughout the patristic era, because that's a big deal for them to understand the Trinity. It's one of the major controversies in the patristic era. And so as you're trying to understand the Trinity, that would be a good place to go, right? If you're trying to understand ecclesiology, the doctrine of the church, it would be good to look at Cyprian. The Novatian Schism in the 3rd century, which was a schism, the first schism, actually, of all time in the church. And it was an ecclesiological schism. It was based on their understanding of what the church was and really what the church ought to be. And so when you're looking at these ideas, it's good to get a historical perspective on these ideas. And that's really all we're doing with historical theology. When you see in your reading, for instance, McGrath is going to say that historical theology is a resource for theology in the present. I think that's a really great way to put it, is that as we study historical theology, that gives us more raw material, so to speak, from which we can reflect theologically presently to determine what we believe about these major concepts. We're informed by these brilliant men and women throughout this, the past 2,000 years to determine, how we ought to think about these things. And so that's a good thing. The unfortunate thing is that we often don't do that. And so one of the things that I'm really excited about with this course is the fact that you've even signed up for it. Because unfortunately, we tend to ignore history. One example of this would be that you might be aware of the fact that most Christians are willing to spend $20 or so, on a new book from John Piper, John MacArthur, any of these big name guys out there, Francis Chan, Rob Bell, maybe, a lot of these guys out there that are, putting these books out. A lot of Christians are willing to put down $15, $20 for their books, unaware of the fact that you can get the entire Ante-Nicene, Nicene, and Post-Nicene Fathers on Amazon Kindle for $3. That's a total of 1,000 books, and you can get all 1,000 books for $3. Yet most Christians that I've met are not willing to spend the $3 or the time it takes to read any of that. And yet you've got, Tertullian, you've got Irenaeus, you've got Augustine, you've got all these different guys in there. This is the first, probably 400 or 500 years of the church in the Ante-Nicene, Nicene, and Post-Nicene Fathers for $3, and yet we're generally not willing to look at that. And so church history is fruitful ground for theological reflection, and yet it often is left untilled, so to speak. C.S. Lewis, in his Surprised by Joy, refers to this as chronological snobbery, and Lewis is often quite good at turning a phrase like that. And, he's one of those people that will will spend money on Mere Christianity and, that sort of thing. But it won't be long before we won't, because he'll fall prey to our chronological snobbery. Probably within my lifetime, we'll have people who don't really want to read Lewis anymore because he's too old, and new is what is cool, and new is what is exciting, and that sort of thing. And so what I'm hoping will happen, and I'm optimistic that it will happen, given that you've already registered for this course, is that what we will do in this course will spur you on towards not only more historical theology of your own, but actually that you will become infectious in the church, that you will motivate other people to pick up Confessions by Augustine, or City of God, or On the Trinity, any of these things by Augustine, or On the Incarnation by Athanasius, is a classic classic writing of the early church, Against Heresies by Irenaeus. These are monumental works that we really should be reading, and so it's my hope that you can sort of be my agents of historical theology in the church. That you would motivate people to do this, and not just with the patristic period. That we would have people, even if they aren't Calvinists, that we would have people reading Calvin's Institutes of the Christian Religion. Because his institutes are a landmark achievement in theology, whether you agree with him or not. And to tip my hand a little bit, I don't agree with him. I'm not a Calvinist. But I have a great deal of respect for John Calvin and what he's done in theology. And so, hopefully you can motivate people to read these sorts of things. And, latent within me saying that you would develop a greater ability to read things that you disagree with and sift through to learn from your opponents, so to speak, that you would gain from them rather than just blatantly ignoring them, which is what we tend to do in the church, is we take people that we don't agree with and we just kind of discount them out of hand rather than carefully listening to their perspective and learning from it. Even if we're just learning what we don't believe, and getting a better appreciation for what we don't believe, that's still useful, and so that's basically the thrust of the course that we're going to be focusing on, looking at these theological concepts through history. Another quote that I want to leave you with is from a professor from Yale, late professor from Yale. He passed away several years ago, named Yaroslav Pelikan. He's written a great deal on the history of the church. He's got, I think, 8 volumes covering basically the entire history of the church from the apostolic period up to today. And here's what Yaroslav Pelikan has to say. He says, tradition is the living faith of the dead. Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. And I suppose I should add, it is traditionalism that gives tradition such a bad name. The reformers of every age, whether political or religious or literary, have protested against the tyranny of the dead, and in doing so, have called for innovation and insight in place of tradition. And I think this is a very instructive quote regarding, what Lewis calls chronological snobbery, because this is precisely what we do. Rather than learning from our past, we end up repeating it. The old adage, those who don't learn from history repeat it. And I've often heard it amended to say those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it, and those who do learn from history are doomed to watch everyone else repeat it. And there's some truth in that, And so I'm hoping to, incrementally change that, at least within the walls of the church. And so, we have nothing to worry from studying history. We, even though Augustine isn't scripture, he's still a spiritual giant that we can learn from. And just as much as you would listen to sermons and read books and listen to podcasts from, respected spiritual leaders today, we ought to also do that from the history of the church. And one simple practical lesson that we can learn from the church is a lot of the questions that we ask, a lot of the issues that we run into have already been solved. One easy example of this is if you carefully study Gnosticism, there are a lot of similarities between Gnosticism and a lot of the things that the church is facing today. As a matter of fact, Dr. Fairbairn has often said that Gnosticism is the one battle that the church never effectively won. Gnosticism has stayed around since it started, and we've never really gotten rid of it. And I would have to say he's right about that, at least in the form of Mormonism. Gnosticism is incredibly similar in a lot of ways, not in every way, but in a lot of ways with Mormonism. And I'm not saying that Mormonism came from Gnosticism or anything like that, but there are similar issues. And so the solution to one, the critique of one, is often useful against the other. Okay, and so it's my hope in this course that we would really appreciate these different historical periods. Even when we look at them and say there are things that we don't like about them, I can more or less tell you there are going to be things that you don't like about the patristic period. There are things that I don't like about the patristic period, in spite of the fact that I've devoted a great deal of my life to it. There are things that they do in biblical interpretation which would not pass in a modern hermeneutics or exegesis course. I teach exegesis and hermeneutics, and I would not pass a lot of the patristic authors with their treatment of Scripture. And so, there's things that you're not going to like, but what we have to do when we find those is question, do we not like it because it's wrong? Or do we not like it because it's very different from us? And if we only don't like it because it's very different from us, then perhaps there is a challenge latent within it that we ought to be aware of. And if we can face that challenge and recognize the issue there, then we may actually need to course correct. And there's actually a lot about biblical interpretation in the patristic period that has caused me to adjust the way that I approach Scripture. Not that I would wholesale adopt the way that they approach the Bible, but that I've adjusted the way that I personally approach the Bible. And that's been really helpful. And so hopefully through the course of these readings and your research and our discussion posts, you will find some of these challenges that sort of rub you the wrong way a little bit, and hopefully they will spur you on towards greater theological development. That's the goal for the course. But that is essentially historical theology, that we would look at the great tradition of Christianity for the past 2,000 years and recognize that it is very likely that we don't have everything right, and that someone in those 2,000 years probably has something that we can learn from. And so it is my hope that together that we would all learn from them.